What if a billionaire's $100 million deal depended on 4 whispered words from a waitress? The question hung in the night like smoke from a half-burned cigar. And inside Aurelia, the sort of Manhattan restaurant where fortunes were toasted and reputations quietly buried, the answer was about to be written on a linen napkin. Harrison Sterling sat at table 12, the unofficial throne of the house. The alcove offered a wide-angle view of the skyline, as though the whole city had gathered to admire him. At 38, he was the golden son of green energy, the boy genius who had grown into a man with his hands firmly wrapped around the future. His Tom Ford suit looked less like clothing and more like an armor stitched from ambition. He carried himself the way men do when every newspaper has already declared them indispensable. The investors flanking him were worth billions themselves, but looked like parishioners in his church. Davenport, silver-haired and patrician, had the air of someone whose family tree produced more senators than farmers. Tanaka, flown in from Tokyo, exuded quiet calculation, his face unreadable, but his posture deferential. And then there was Dr. Robert Kendrick, Sterling's head of R&D, puffed up like a rooster in borrowed feathers. Kendrick scribbled formulas onto a napkin with the flourish of a man convinced he was rewriting the laws of the universe. The room hummed with that quiet, wealth-scented energy: truffle oil, aged leather, the faint bite of vintage champagne. Waiters moved like shadows, their shoes whispering across the carpet, their voices carefully erased. One of them, Isabella Rossi, drifted to the table with a pitcher of water. She wore the same black and white uniform as the others, but her eyes carried the heavy fatigue of someone who had outgrown anonymity yet been forced back into it. She poured steadily, practiced hands hiding the tremor in her wrist. To Davenport, she was invisible. To Tanaka, a polite blur. To Kendrick, an interruption. But to Sterling, at least for a moment, she was part of the background against which his empire glittered. On the napkin, Kendrick's pen moved in graceful arcs. He narrated each stroke with the confidence of a man who'd rehearsed the speech in his bathroom mirror. We maximize the tunneling probability for the proton transfer by manipulating the electron spin state across the lattice, he explained. The words floated like incense. Too dense for the investors, but sweet enough to impress. Sterling studied the scrawl, eyes narrowing with the intensity of someone who'd staked more than money on it, his legacy, his very identity. Isabella's gaze flickered toward the napkin. Just a glance, no more than the length of a heartbeat. But that heartbeat dragged her 6 years backward to a dusty Caltech lab, to whiteboards heavy with her handwriting, to nights when equations had been companions more loyal than friends, and then to betrayal. Her name, scrubbed from the research, her warnings dismissed, her future sold off like clearance stock. The last term on Kendrick's napkin, the delicate balancing factor of the tunneling function, stabbed at her memory like glass under skin. She knew that term. She had birthed it, shaped it, and buried it when she realized it carried a fatal flaw. Under high pressure, the equation wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. Her breath caught. The water pitcher in her hand suddenly weighed 100 pounds. Around her, the restaurant kept breathing, forks chiming like crickets, muffled laughter from tables drenched in candlelight. But Isabella heard only the rush of blood in her ears. Kendrick slid the napkin forward, a conjurer revealing his final card. Davenport nodded with theatrical solemnity. Tanaka gave the smallest of bows. Sterling reached for the Mont Blanc pen laid before him. The contracts waited, eager for ink. The future was seconds away. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She could say nothing, remain a ghost, and let the world march toward disaster. Or she could speak and risk everything. Her job, her fragile anonymity, what little stability she had left. She saw Kendrick's smirk, saw the headlines unwritten. Explosion at Sterling Dynamics plant. And something inside her, something that had been smothered under years of exhaustion, clawed its way back to life. Her feet moved before her reason could protest. She leaned forward, close enough to refill Sterling's glass, her smile a mask of perfect professionalism. But her lips brushed the air beside his ear, and the whisper slipped out, softer than breath, sharper than steel. "Don't sign! That's the wrong formula." The pen froze midair. The universe, at least for Harrison Sterling, ground to a halt. Harrison's hand hovered, the Mont Blanc trembling, like it had caught a chill. His world, a neat ledger of risks and returns, suddenly had an entry he hadn't budgeted for. A waitress whispering quantum heresy. He half-turned, storm-gray eyes locking onto Isabella's. They weren't the eyes of a woman begging for tips. They were sharp, haunted, certain. He'd stared down senators, outfoxed rivals, and bulldozed entire industries. But those eyes unsettled him. They carried the weight of someone who'd walked through fire and come out carrying ashes for proof. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, meant for her alone, but it carried the promise of thunder. The table stilled. Davenport's hand froze halfway to his wineglass. Tanaka stopped blinking. Kendrick's smirk faltered, though he tried to glue it back in place. Isabella straightened, retreating half a step, instinct telling her to vanish into the shadows. "Forgive me," she murmured, her mask of politeness sliding back on. "I misspoke." But Harrison Sterling hadn't clawed his way to billions by ignoring anomalies. His instinct screamed that this wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a crack in the foundation. "No," he said, sharp enough to cut glass. "You didn't." Kendrick barked a laugh, brittle and too quick. "Harrison, really? Are we entertaining nonsense from the staff now?" "She's trying to impress you with gobbledygook," probably memorized a term from a textbook. Isabella's eyes flicked toward him. Contempt, not fear, lived there. She turned back to Harrison, voice steady, almost gentle, as though she were trying to save him from stepping onto a landmine. "The probability function for tunneling, your last term, it assumes static electron density. That's not reality. Under pressure, electrons shift. You'll get instability, violent byproducts. You're not holding a green solution, Mr. Sterling. You're holding a fuse." The words fell like stones into the hushed room. Davenport blinked hard, lost at sea. Tanaka leaned forward slightly, as if trying to translate science into profit margins. But Harrison's face shifted in increments, from disbelief to suspicion to the cold recognition of a man who has just glimpsed the outline of betrayal. Kendrick sputtered, color draining from his cheeks. "She's lying. She's nobody. A failed student, if that failed." Isabella's voice carried steel wrapped in velvet. "Or erased." For the first time all evening, Harrison Sterling capped his pen. The click was louder than the jazz murmuring from the corner quartet. He placed it down neatly beside the unsigned contract, then rose, his height and presence dwarfing the table. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, his tone the calm eye of a brewing storm, "enjoy dessert on me. I need a word with Miss Rossi." He didn't wait for permission. He simply walked, expecting her to follow, and the restaurant parted around him as if the tide had gone out. Isabella felt the eyes of 100 diners burn holes in her back. Her manager, Francois, barreled toward her. His face flushed the color of raw steak. "Rosie, what in God's name?" "She's with me." Harrison's voice cut through the dining room without raising an octave. He didn't look at Francois, didn't need to. The authority in his tone said lawsuits, ruined reputations, maybe bankruptcy. Francois froze, mouth open but words dead on his tongue. Isabella untied her apron with slow, deliberate hands, laid it on a side table, and walked after the billionaire into the night. The doors of Aurelia swung closed behind them, shutting her old life inside. Outside, Manhattan's chill wrapped around her like a baptism. Harrison's Maybach idled at the curb, its black paint swallowing the streetlight. He opened the door himself, a gesture not of courtesy, but of command. She stepped in, sinking into leather that smelled of power and money, alien and suffocating. The ride south was wrapped in silence. Neon streaked across the tinted windows, painting her face in flashes of green and red. Harrison studied her like a puzzle he didn't trust, but couldn't put down. She sat with her hands folded, the water pitcher gone, but the weight of what she'd said heavier than any tray she'd carried. At last, in the private elevator of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the clouds, he spoke. "Your name? Isabella Rossi. And you are a waitress, and not a question." A statement that didn't add up. Yes. Tonight the elevator chimed. The doors opened to a vast office, all steel and glass and money. Manhattan sprawled beneath them, glittering like it had been built for him alone. Harrison turned to face her fully, the city's light carving hard lines into his features. "Before tonight, what were you?" For a moment, Isabella's throat closed, the ghosts of 6 years pressing against her ribs. But she lifted her chin, voice steady. "A doctoral candidate in computational chemistry, Caltech, until my advisor and his favorite protege stole my work and buried me with it." The silence between them was electric, not empty. Harrison's jaw tightened. He had read that paper. He had built half his empire on it. And if what she said was true, then the woman in front of him hadn't just saved him from a mistake. She had just saved him from disaster. Harrison Sterling had always thought of truth as a currency, something you could spend carefully, hedge against, even delay until the timing suited you. But that night in the glass tower, he found himself staring at a young woman who refused to treat truth like a negotiable asset. Isabella Rossi sat across from him in the white, humming belly of his R&D floor, fingers flying across a holographic keyboard, each keystroke peeling another layer off the life he thought he controlled. The servers thrummed like beehives, steady and relentless. Their blue lights winked across the glass walls, giving the impression that the entire lab was pulsing with a nervous heartbeat. Harrison paced the length of the observation corridor. His polished shoes made soft thuds on the clean tile. But in his chest, the sound was louder, like hammers striking doubts he had never allowed to surface before. How much of this empire rests on lies? The thought slithered, uninvited, but once there, it refused to leave. He glanced at Isabella, who seemed more alive in this sterile tomb of machines than he'd ever seen her in the restaurant. Her eyes, once dulled by repetition and exhaustion, now burned with an intensity he recognized, the fire of someone who had married their soul to an equation. He remembered his own days as a graduate student, Long nights hunched over problem sets. The thrill of wrestling with atoms and probabilities until they yielded something like understanding. He had traded that for boardrooms and balance sheets, for a life where numbers had dollar signs attached, not sigma values. Seeing Isabella at the console was like looking into a mirror he hadn't dared to polish in 20 years. "Here," she said suddenly, breaking his reverie. Her voice was calm but carried a quiet triumph. She pulled up a raw log, a jagged spike rising in the middle of an otherwise smooth curve. "This is your clean data before Kendrick scrubbed it. Look at the anomaly. It's not a glitch. It's instability exactly where my corrected formula predicted." Harrison leaned in. The faint glow of the screen painting sharp planes across his face. He read quickly, his mind catching old rhythms, the part of him that still understood the language of electrons and wave functions. And there it was. An ugly peak, brief but undeniable. "He buried it," she continued, her tone tight with anger. She tried to keep professional. "He wrote a script to mask these spikes, to overwrite them with fabricated values. Every time the reactor model showed danger, he told the machine to lie." Harrison straightened, his jaw locking. Outside, the city blinked on in its oblivious rhythm, traffic lights changing for drivers who would never know how close their world had come to being built on a bomb. Inside, the air grew heavier, a pressure that had nothing to do with physics. "Can you prove intent?" he asked quietly. His voice had cooled into steel. "Investors don't care about mistakes, but fraud they'll hang him for." Isabella didn't look up. Her fingers moved with the certainty of muscle memory, opening directories Kendrick had thought invisible. "Yes, give me time. Liars always leave fingerprints. He's too arrogant not to." And she found them. Line by line, routine by routine, she unearthed evidence. Hidden subfolders, duplicate logs with conflicting timestamps, scripts written in a style too distinctive to be anyone else's. Each discovery was another nail hammered into the coffin of Dr. Robert Kendrick's credibility. But buried deepest was something Harrison hadn't expected, a locked archive named, innocently, tucked beneath system processes. Isabella's brows furrowed as she prodded the encryption. "This isn't company standard. It's personal, AES 256, deliberate." He was hiding something here, something he couldn't afford anyone to see. Harrison's pulse quickened. He remembered Kendrick's swagger at the table earlier, his smug flourish on the napkin, the oily confidence of a man too sure he'd already won. If Isabella could crack this vault, the truth might not just sink a man, it might expose an entire conspiracy. She closed her eyes briefly, dredging memory. "Albright," she whispered. The name landed like sour wine on Harrison's tongue. She remembered the professor's obsession with quoting Einstein in German, his pompous delight in borrowed brilliance. With a steady hand she typed, "Gott ist subtil, aber ist nicht boshaft." The screen blinked. Then it opened. 2 files appeared, and for a moment the lab seemed to tilt around them. The first was a ledger. Cold numbers, untraceable cryptocurrency transfers. Cayman Islands accounts. $5 million flowing into 2 hands, Kendrick and Albright. The second file was an audio recording. "Play it," Harrison ordered. The lab filled with Kendrick's voice, casual, conspiratorial, soaked in treachery. He laid out the scheme, speaking to Richard Hayes, Sterling's oldest rival. Isabella sat frozen, every syllable reopening wounds that had never scarred properly. Harrison listened with clenched fist as Kendrick described the plan. Build the unstable catalyst. Let Sterling Dynamics collapse under lawsuits and regulators, then sell the corrected formula, Isabella's formula, to Hayes for pennies on the dollar. When the recording ended, silence fell like a blade. Harrison's reflection stared back at him from the glass, and in it he saw not the master of an empire, but a man inches from ruin, saved only by a waitress who refused to stay silent. "Copy everything," he said finally, voice taut as wire. "I already have," Isabella replied, sliding the drive from the port. The small black stick seemed too fragile to hold so much betrayal. That was when the alert flashed. Unauthorized Level 1, access detected. Sector 7, Wu. Harrison froze. Only he and Isabella had that clearance now. Unless Kendrick had built himself a backdoor. Gavin's voice came crackling through the intercom. "Not our key? It's him. He's trying to remote wipe." Isabella's hands blurred across the console, severing connections, locking networks, forcing the system into a local-only loop. The servers gave a heavy sigh, lights dimming, then stabilizing as her commands took root. "It's too late for him," she said, not looking up. "I've got the files isolated." But Gavin's next words stole the fragile victory. "Physical breach. Restricted lab corridor. He's inside the building." The hum of the servers suddenly sounded louder, more menacing, like the intake of breath before a shout. Harrison's face hardened, the fury in him controlled but volcanic. "Lock the wing," he said. The magnetic seals clamped shut with a metallic thump that echoed through the floor. For a brief moment, safety felt tangible. But then the high-pitched whine of a drill cut through the silence. Metal screamed. Kendrick wasn't outside anymore. He was coming in. Isabella's pulse raced. Her mind, trained in equations, now calculated survival. She slipped the drive into her pocket, the weight of it pressing against her thigh like a promise. Her eyes scanned the sterile lab for options. She spotted it. A maintenance hatch, half hidden behind a server rack, bolts fat and stubborn. She grabbed a stool, flipped it, and began wrenching the bolts loose. The sound of drilling grew louder, closer, a predator chewing through the only barrier left. Her muscles ached, arms straining, but one by one the bolts gave way. She pried the hatch open and felt a rush of cold, recycled air wash over her face. Beyond the panel stretched darkness, a crawl space leading into the guts of the skyscraper. Behind her, the door juddered. Gavin's voice was a tight thread in her ear. 30 seconds, maybe less, move. She didn't hesitate. She slid into the shaft, dragging the panel closed behind her. Total darkness swallowed her, broken only by the smell of dust and machine oil. She began to crawl, every scrape of her knees a reminder that the future of an empire, and maybe her own stolen life, rested in the small drive pressed against her hip. And behind her, in the lab she had fled, the sound of metal giving way rang out like a gunshot. The shaft was no bigger than a coffin laid sideways, and Isabella crawled through it with the graceless determination of someone who'd rather scrape skin off her knees than lose the only evidence that could topple giants. Dust coated her tongue, bitter as old pennies, and each time she drew breath the air smelled of rust and machine oil. Somewhere behind her, muffled by metal, came the distant thud of a door giving way. Kendrick was in. Her palms slid across the corrugated surface, nails breaking, skin stinging. She told herself she'd felt worse. Late nights waitressing with blisters, mornings when grief was heavier than hunger. But the thought was small comfort. Fear had a way of stripping life down to its simplest equation. Keep moving or die. The hum of the building's ventilation system pressed in, a low and steady roar that made her ears ring. Every few yards, a blast of cold air shot past her face, making her eyes water. She crawled faster, driven by the thought of Kendrick's footsteps echoing in the lab, of his hands clawing for the very machine she'd abandoned only minutes ago. If he destroys the servers, the only copy left is me. The weight of the drive in her pocket was a comfort and a curse. She touched it once, just to make sure it was still there, and felt the sharp edges bite into her fingertips. A talisman, yes, but also a target. She reached a junction, the shaft splitting left and right. Darkness offered no guidance. She shut her eyes, summoned the blueprint she had memorized under the sterile glow of the lab monitors. Left toward the circulation fan, then down. She turned left. The metal grew colder under her palms, vibrating faintly with the rhythm of an industrial giant at work. A sound rose ahead, deep and menacing. The steady churn of the air circulation fan. It throbbed like the breath of some enormous beast trapped in the walls. She remembered the schematic note, bypass carefully, which in plain English meant crawl fast or be shredded like lettuce. The fan's roar grew louder until it drowned her own heartbeat. The tunnel narrowed, forcing her to flatten her body against the ribs of the shaft. She felt the gust before she saw the blades. Blasts of icy wind that burned her lungs, carrying the metallic tang of ozone. When the light from a safety bulb flickered across the blades, it revealed a blur of steel teeth spinning with murderous patience. Her hands trembled, sweat slicking the metal beneath her. "You don't belong here," whispered the part of her that remembered Table 12 and linen napkins. But another voice, sharper, refused to yield. "You don't belong anywhere until you take back what they stole." She inched forward, timing her movements with the whoosh of the blades. Her hair whipped across her face, caught in the draft. She ducked lower, pressed flat, and pulled herself past the danger. The fan roared behind her, denied its meal. The silence on the far side was almost holy. She lay still for a moment, chest heaving, the cold metal seeping into her bones. Then she heard it, the faint, distant echo of footsteps. Not in the shaft, no, that was impossible, but somewhere parallel. Maybe in the maintenance corridor that shadowed this one. Kendrick. He was hunting too. Her gut twisted. She pushed forward, refusing to let fear calcify her limbs. The shaft slanted downward now, gravity tugging at her elbows. She slid more than crawled, the sound of fabric tearing loud in the confined space. Her phone, long dead, clinked against the metal as she shifted. For a heartbeat, she thought of her mother, sending letters that never got replies, and wondered if this crawl through darkness was what her life had been since the betrayal. One long, suffocating tunnel. The slope ended at a vertical drop, a ladder, just as she'd remembered. She swung her legs over the edge, boots scraping for purchase on the rungs. The ladder was slick with condensation, the smell of mildew rising like a warning. She began to climb down, careful, controlled, though her muscles quivered from exhaustion. Halfway down, a sound made her freeze, the metallic echo of a panel being kicked open above. A flashlight beam sliced into the shaft, bouncing off the walls. Kendrick's voice floated down, ragged with fury. "You can't hide in my building, Isabella. You're just prolonging the inevitable." Her heart punched against her ribs. She forced herself to keep descending, each movement deliberate. The drive pressed against her thigh, reminding her of what was at stake. She reached the bottom and shoved at the access panel. It resisted, rusted tight. She braced her shoulder against it, pushing until her muscles screamed. The panel gave way with a groan. She tumbled into a deserted office floor, cubicles stretching like grave markers in dim light. The air smelled of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals, the kind of place where dreams had been filed away with expense reports. She lay there, listening. Above, Kendrick cursed, the clang of his boots receding as he searched another path. Relief washed over her, thin but real. She staggered to her feet, brushing dust from her torn uniform. Her eyes found the stairwell door across the room, glowing faintly with a red exit sign. Hope flickered. She ran, her footsteps echoing across the dead office. Each stride was agony, but she welcomed the pain. Pain meant she was alive, still moving, still fighting. She burst into the stairwell, the air cooler, tinged with concrete dust. She flew downward, 2 steps at a time, lungs burning, knees threatening mutiny. On the lower floors, the building stirred. Janitors starting shifts, the faint clatter of carts, the hum of vending machines. Life returning to a place that had nearly become her tomb. And then, salvation, the lobby doors. She pushed through into a cavern of marble and glass. The city outside glowed with the first breath of dawn, streets painted silver by the rising sun. And in the center of the lobby, as if he had been carved from the same obsidian he loved for desks, stood Harrison Sterling. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face pale, eyes raw with something she had never seen in him before. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. She stumbled into the open, hair wild, skin streaked with dust, uniform torn like battle clothes. Her hands shot out, holding the small black drive as if it were a holy relic. "I have it," she gasped. Her voice was shredded, but every word rang clear. "I have everything." The words echoed in the vast lobby, swallowed by marble and glass, and for a moment she felt the scales of the universe shift. Behind her, the elevator chimed. The elevator chimed like a polite host announcing a guest, but the man who stepped out looked more like a burglar caught mid-crime. Dr. Robert Kendrick's once proud suit hung loose, his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, and a portable drill swung in his grip like some medieval weaponry. The marble lobby, all shining white and cool echoes, threw his reflection back at him a dozen times. One desperate man multiplied into an army of guilt. His eyes landed on Isabella first. Dust streaked her cheek, her black uniform torn at the sleeve, the look of someone dragged through hell and still carrying fire in her pocket. Then his gaze shifted to Harrison Sterling, tall and immovable, a small black thumb drive glinting in his hand. Kendrick's pupils tightened. He knew exactly what that drive contained. With a guttural sound, half snarl, half sob, he lunged. The drill slipped from his hand and clattered across the marble, the sound ringing through the lobby like a warning bell. Harrison didn't flinch. 2 security men surged forward, dark suits moving with mechanical precision. Kendrick hit the floor in seconds, knees cracking against stone, wrists pinned like broken wings. He writhed, face mashed against the cold surface, still trying to conjure dignity from the ruins. Isabella stood frozen, chest heaving. She had pictured this moment before, her betrayer undone, stripped of his lies. But reality was less triumphant, more tragic. He looked smaller now, reduced to a man caught stealing crumbs after years of feasting on banquets that weren't his. Yet pity couldn't undo damage. She pressed her fingers against the drive in Harrison's grip and felt the heat of proof burning through plastic. "Upstairs," Harrison said quietly, The kind of quiet that brooked no refusal. We end this where it began. They moved together, Harrison leading with measured steps, Isabella close enough to feel the wake of his presence, security dragging Kendrick between them like a sack of old tools. The marble lobby watched them leave, its tall glass walls glowing faintly with the gray hint of dawn. Outside, Manhattan stirred awake. Taxis coughing on street corners, bakery doors unlocking, the city entirely unaware that the fate of a company, and maybe an entire industry, was being carried into an elevator. Inside the mirrored lift, silence reigned. The fluorescent light painted everyone pale, like actors waiting backstage. Kendrick leaned against the wall, breathing ragged, wrists cuffed in front. He lifted his head and gave a crooked smile, blood smeared across his lip. "You think this is truth," he rasped, "but truth is just the story that gets printed first. You're playing with narratives, not numbers." Isabella's hands curled into fists. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that math didn't bend, that science didn't lie. But she knew better. Equations could be twisted, reports rewritten, data silenced. She was proof of that. What mattered wasn't that truth couldn't be bent, but that someone had to stand it back up when it was. She looked him straight in the eye, and her voice came steady, almost gentle. "You call it narrative. I call it theft." Harrison said nothing. He watched the floor numbers climb, jaw tight, every inch of him carved from stone. His mind was running faster than the elevator, the investors waiting upstairs, the rival poised to exploit any weakness, the woman beside him who had appeared from nowhere yet carried the only lifeline his company had left. He had played games of billions, had outmaneuvered sharks in suits finer than his. But this was chaos in human form. And somehow he trusted it more than the polished lies he'd been sold. The elevator opened to the executive floor. The air was warmer here, tinged with cedar from paneling and the faint sharpness of expensive cologne. Down the hallway, the glass-walled conference room glowed with dawn spilling across Manhattan. At the table sat Mr. Davenport, silver hair gleaming, posture immaculate, eyes like a banker's ledger, precise and skeptical. By the windows stood Kenji Tanaka, hands in pockets, his face calm as a monk, but his silence sharp as a blade. They turned when Harrison entered with his entourage. Their gazes slid from the billionaire to the waitress in torn black cloth, to the scientist in cuffs. Davenport's lips thinned. Tanaka's brows lifted a fraction. "Gentlemen," Harrison said, his tone clipped, "this morning will not go as planned." "Not go as planned," Davenport repeated slowly. His voice carried the weight of old money offended by inefficiency. "At midnight, you promise signatures, Harrison. At dawn, you bring us this." He gestured with distaste toward Isabella and Kendrick. "Are we investors or spectators at some tawdry spectacle?" Tanaka said nothing. He studied Isabella instead, eyes unreadable, as if weighing not her words, but the steadiness of her breath. Isabella gripped the back of a chair. The wood was polished, smooth, and under her fingers it grounded her. She forced herself to speak, though her voice wanted to hide. "I stopped him from signing because the formula is wrong. Not a little wrong. Catastrophically wrong." Kendrick gave a strained laugh. "Listen to her. A waitress with dust on her cheek and opinions on quantum mechanics. Harrison, you've gone mad if you let this ruin us." Harrison finally moved, placing the thumb drive on the table with deliberate care. "This drive contains Dr. Kendrick's real work, Hidden files, falsified reports, and a recording where he sells my company's destruction to Richard Hayes. It also proves that the corrected formula, the only formula that works, was stolen from Miss Rossi. 6 years ago, Davenport leaned back, steepling his fingers. Stolen? Yes, Harrison said, and buried. Until tonight, Tanaka's gaze sharpened. Play it. Harrison plugged in the drive. The large screen on the wall flickered to life, spilling cold light across the table. The audio began. Kendrick's voice, smug and careless, speaking of EPA tips and lawsuits timed to perfection. Then Hayes, smooth as oil, asking after the stable formula. And then the phrase that cut Isabella like a knife reopened. Albright's little protege figured it out years ago. Her chest tightened. For a moment she was back in that lab, chalk dust on her hands, hearing her professor dismiss her discovery as nerves. The word little echoed like a taunt. Her knuckles whitened against the chair. The recording ended. Silence followed, heavy and raw. Davenport's face had gone pale. He didn't like betrayal, not because it was immoral, but because it was messy. Tanaka's lips pressed tight, the only sign of emotion he allowed. Harrison broke the silence. His voice was low, cold, and unyielding. This is not rumor. This is treason. Against my company. Against every dollar you were prepared to commit. And against the people who would have trusted us not to build a bomb. He looked at Isabella then, and for the first time, not as a waitress, not even as a whistleblower. He looked at her as the person who had walked through fire to bring him proof. Show them the math, he said. The conference room felt colder than the glass walls should allow. Outside, the skyline was flushing gold with sunrise. But inside, the light seemed trapped in steel and silence. Isabella stood at the end of the table with every eye on her. The old banker's stare, sharp with suspicion. The Japanese investor's calm gaze, like a sword half-drawn. Harrison's steady watch, heavy with expectation, and Kendrick's glare, venomous as a snake cornered. She swallowed. Her hands trembled, though not from fear alone. Years of silence were coiled inside her. Years of carrying equations in her head like smuggled contraband. Now, at last, she could set them free. Harrison slid a stylus across the obsidian table toward her. The board belongs to you, he said. Her fingers closed around the pen. It felt heavier than it should, as if weighted by the ghosts of chalk and whiteboards she had once worshipped. She turned to the glass wall behind her, where a touchscreen glowed faintly. With a flick, the display came alive, blank and waiting. She began to write. Symbols bloomed on the board, strokes swift and confident, each one pulling her further from waitress uniforms and back into the realm where her mind had always belonged. Here, she said, her voice steadier now, is Kendrick's version of the tunneling probability function. It looks clean, elegant, too elegant. That's because it ignores reality. It assumes a static electron density as if atoms behave like gentlemen in top hats, always keeping their place at the table. But under high energy, they riot. Her hand moved faster, lines connecting, exponents climbing. She wrote the correction term, the relativistic adjustment that had cost her sleep and sanity 6 years ago. It appeared on the screen, small yet seismic. This term, she said, circling it, changes everything. Without it, your catalyst is stable on paper and lethal in practice. With it, efficiency rises, but more importantly, the reaction stays under control. That's the difference between green energy and an industrial bomb. Davenport adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. He understood dollars, not deltas, but even he could see the shift from polished simplicity to raw truth. The line of his mouth softened, not approval yet, but the first crack in his fortress of doubt. Tanaka, however, was already nodding, his sharp eyes flicking from equation to equation. "The sigma correction," he murmured. His accent was light, but his tone decisive. Elegant, obvious once seen. Invisible until then, Kendrick barked a laugh, loud and brittle. "Smoke and mirrors. Anyone can scrawl math and call it gospel. She's spinning fairy tales and you're buying tickets." His voice climbed, desperate. "Ask for peer review. Publish data. Citations. Don't let a failed student hijack millions with theatrics." The insult landed, but Harrison didn't blink. He leaned on the table, his storm-colored eyes locked on Kendrick. "Theatrics? Robert, theatrics is when a man falsifies simulations, hides anomalies, and cashes $5 million from my rival. What Ms. Rossi just showed is what you tried to bury. Truth doesn't need footnotes when it's carving you open." Kendrick's face flushed, veins standing out at his temple. "You don't know what you're risking. That formula is untested. You'll bankrupt yourselves chasing phantoms." "Better bankrupt than murderers," Isabella said softly. Her words were quiet but heavy, and the room seemed to bend around them. Harrison straightened, his suit whispering against leather. For a moment, the mask of the billionaire cracked, and something older showed through. The boy who had once stared at blackboards, who had once trusted numbers before he trusted men. He saw himself in her, raw, stubborn, unwilling to let power silence truth. He turned back to the investors. "Gentlemen, you asked for vision. This is it. Not the polished napkin lies of a coward, but the corrected equation of someone who risked her life to bring it here. Decide where you want your money. In a coffin with Kendrick, or in the future with Rossi." The silence broke with Davenport's sigh. "My God," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, "I nearly signed away our fortune to a fraud." He looked at Isabella then, truly looked, and the old arrogance dimmed a fraction. "Miss Rossi, if what you say holds in the lab, it will change not only our deal, but the world's energy ledger." Tanaka inclined his head. "The truth burns brighter than profit." "I am satisfied," Kendrick lunged forward, cuffs clattering against polished wood. "Satisfied? You fools. Do you know what Hayes will do when he realizes you've turned? You think a rival like him plays fair? He will grind Sterling Dynamics into dust. And you, Rossi, he'll tear your name apart before it even rises." His spit hit the table, and for a moment the room smelled of copper and rage. Isabella's pulse hammered, but instead of shrinking, she met his glare with something fiercer. "Let him try. I've already lived invisible. What's one more storm?" Her words echoed in the vast glass room, small but unbreakable. Harrison slammed his hand on the table, the crack like a gunshot. "Enough. You've had your stage, Robert. Now you'll have a cell." He nodded to the guards, who dragged Kendrick back, his protests echoing down the corridor like the final rattle of a man undone. The room exhaled as if a storm had passed. Isabella lowered the stylus, her hand trembling not from weakness, but from release. She had carved her truth into glass, and it glowed there still, undeniable. Harrison looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since Aurelia, a faint smile touched his mouth. Not the smile of a tycoon sealing a deal, but of a man witnessing something rare, courage in its rawest form. "Gentlemen," he said, turning back to Davenport and Tanaka, "the deal we came here to sign is dead, but a new one stands before you, stronger, cleaner, honest. He gestured to Isabella. The future wears no suit. Tonight it wore an apron, but tomorrow it builds reactors that won't kill our children. The investors sat in silence, the city glowing behind them, the weight of choice pressing in. And in the hush, Isabella felt something she hadn't in years. Not fear, not fury, but possibility. The glass walls trembled with silence long after Kendrick's shackled figure had been dragged out. The boardroom still smelled of sweat and tension, as if truth itself had a physical odor. Isabella stood beside the glowing equations, chest rising and falling like she'd just finished a marathon. Harrison remained at the head of the table, tall and unmoving, a general whose army had not yet decided whether to follow him. Davenport broke the hush first. He leaned back, his old bones creaking against leather, and tapped a finger against his temple. I've been in finance 40 years. I've seen snake oil salesmen, I've seen geniuses, and I've seen plenty who thought they were both. But never, he muttered, a waitress with the gall to stop a billionaire at the signature line. Isabella felt her cheeks warm. She wanted to reply, but Harrison cut in smoothly. She isn't a waitress. She's the mind you should have been betting on from the start. His tone was steel wrapped in velvet, the kind that left no room for doubt. Tanaka's gaze flicked between them. His hands were folded neatly on the table, but his voice carried weight. If we invest further, Harrison-san, we are not only betting on equations. We are inviting war. Hayes will not sit quietly. He will strike. Are you ready for that? The name hung heavy in the air. Richard Hayes, Sterling's rival, the man whose shadow stretched across half the industry. Isabella had heard of him even while bussing tables. His reputation oozed out of headlines like oil slicks. Ruthless, charming, and as clean on paper as a saint. No one ever proved his dirt, though everyone smelled it. Harrison's jaw tightened. Hayes has been circling me for years. If he wants war, he'll get it, and this time I'll have the ammunition. He gestured toward Isabella's equations, still glowing on the board. Before another word could be spoken, the door banged open. The guards were back, their expressions grim. Between them, Kendrick struggled, wrists still cuffed, but eyes alight with manic desperation. His suit was torn, his face slick with sweat. One of the guards barked. He tried to break free near the elevators. "Let me speak," Kendrick roared, his voice ragged. "You think you've won? You fools don't know the half of it. Hayes already has the formula, the real one. Albright gave it to him years ago." The words struck like a hammer. Davenport stiffened. Tanaka's calm face twitched. Isabella's breath caught. "That's a lie," she said, though her voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. Kendrick sneered, lips curling. "Is it? Why do you think Hayes bankrolled us in the shadows? Why do you think he paid me? He doesn't just want Sterling ruined. He wants the world thinking Sterling's tech is cursed. So when his version debuts, clean and stable, he looks like the savior. And you, Rossi, you're nothing but the discarded draft. A ghost scribble in someone else's empire." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Isabella's heart thudded painfully. Could it be true? Could Hayes already have her corrected work, stolen from her professor years ago, polished and ready to launch? If so, she wasn't the savior tonight. She was merely too late. Harrison rose slowly, like a storm-gathering weight. His shadow stretched across the table, long and jagged. If Hayes has it, then why pay you to fake stability? Why build a trap instead of a triumph? Kendrick spat, a fleck landing on polished obsidian. Because that's Hayes's genius. He doesn't just want to win. He wants you humiliated. He wants your empire burned so low that when he steps over the ashes, the world will cheer. The investors exchanged uneasy glances. For men used to certainty, the idea of a rival holding the high ground was poison. Isabella gripped the edge of the table, forcing her voice steady. If Hayes truly has my correction, then why was your system still faking data? Why bury anomalies if perfection was already in his pocket? Kendrick faltered. A muscle twitched at his jaw. Because, Isabella pressed, stepping closer. He never had the complete correction. Did he, Robert? He had, whispers, fragments from Albright, enough to bait you, not enough to build. That's why you needed me silenced. That's why you panicked when I spoke. Her words landed with surgical precision. Kendrick's bravado cracked. He sagged against the guards, his eyes darting like a cornered rat. Silence followed. But this time it was different. Thick, not with doubt, but with revelation. Harrison's voice cut through it, low and final. Get him out of my sight. This time, make sure the locks hold. The guards dragged Kendrick away, his protests dwindling to echoes. When the door shut, Harrison looked at the investors, then at Isabella. Gentlemen, the choice is simple. Follow Hayes and risk being pawns in his games, or stand with Rossi and me and own the future. The old banker cleared his throat. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, locked on Isabella. Miss Rossi, you realize what you've done tonight? You've not only exposed fraud, you've painted a target on your back. Hayes won't forgive you. She exhaled slowly. Fear coiled inside her like a cold snake, but beneath it was fire. Then let him aim, she said quietly. At least this time, I'll be standing. Tanaka gave a rare smile, small but genuine. Courage is rarer than genius. Tonight, you showed both. I will stand with you. Davenport hesitated, then nodded. Against my better instincts, so will I. God help us all. Relief flooded Isabella's chest, mingling with terror. She had won allies but also inherited enemies, larger than she had ever imagined. Harrison leaned close, his voice meant only for her. You just changed the battlefield. Hayes doesn't know it yet, but the war starts tonight. And you, Bella, whether you like it or not, are my general. For the first time since that whisper in Aurelia, Isabella allowed herself a small, fierce smile. The waitress was gone. The scientist was back. And the storm ahead no longer terrified her. It beckoned. The boardroom on the 60th floor felt less like a meeting space and more like a battlefield waiting for the first cannon blast. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, showing the morning sun sliding up over Manhattan like a coin tossed onto the table of the sky. Down below, taxis honked, sirens wailed, but up here there was only a strained silence thick enough to butter your bread with. Harrison Sterling stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, jaw tight. His usual air of breezy superiority had been replaced by something rawer, harder, like steel that had just remembered it came for more. Beside him sat Isabella Rossi, still in the black uniform of a waitress, though smudged with dust, her hair loose around her face. She looked like someone who'd climbed out of the ashes and hadn't yet decided whether to collapse or keep walking. Across the obsidian table, mister. Davenport adjusted his cufflinks with the nervousness of a banker whose fortune could turn to sand. Kenji Tanaka sat perfectly still, his face a carved mask, but the tapping of his finger on the armrest betrayed the storm beneath. Both men had invested millions in Sterling Dynamics, and both were expecting an explanation that would decide whether they doubled down or pulled out. And at the far end, shackled and pale, sat Dr. Robert Kendrick. His once pristine suit was wrinkled, his hair plastered with sweat. He looked like a fox dragged from a henhouse, still baring its teeth, but knowing the dogs had already closed in. His eyes darted between Isabella and Harrison, fury and fear wrestling inside. Harrison broke the silence first. His voice was calm in the way of a man who had rehearsed anger into a blade. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the theatrics of the last 12 hours, he began, but theatrics are better than detonations. Last night, we nearly signed away $100 million on a lie. And the only reason we didn't is because someone you would never have noticed, someone pouring your water, saw the truth." He gestured toward Isabella. Davenport blinked, as if trying to reconcile the image of a server with the idea of a scientist. Tanaka merely raised one eyebrow, waiting. Kendrick barked out a laugh that sounded more like a cough. "This is absurd," he snapped. "She's a nothing, a failed student, a dropout who couldn't even finish her PhD. You're throwing away our future on a disgruntled waitress." Isabella lifted her chin. Her voice was steady, though her hands curled into fists in her lap. "I'm the one who derived the tunneling probability function you wrote on that napkin," she said, each word sharp as glass. "I'm the one who warned Marcus Albright it was unstable. He ignored me. You published my work under your names, and now you're gambling with lives because you'd rather be famous than correct." The room hummed with tension. Davenport leaned forward. "Is this true, Robert?" Kendrick sneered, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Of course not. She's trying to take credit." Harrison slammed his palm on the table, the sound ricocheting off the glass walls like a gunshot. "Enough. We don't need his denial. We have proof." He tapped a tablet, and the screen at the far end of the room came alive. File directories appeared, cold and merciless. Hidden logs, altered data streams. The folder marked MA Contingency. With another tap, Harrison played the audio recording. Kendrick's voice spilled into the room, conspiratorial and damning. "Once they break ground on the first plant, we give the data to our contact at the EPA. Sterling Dynamics will be buried in lawsuits. Hayes acquires everything for pennies on the dollar." Then came the second voice, smooth, predatory, unmistakable. Richard Hayes, CEO of Omnigen, Sterling's most dangerous rival. "And the stable formula, you're sure you have it?" The blood drained from Davenport's face. Tanaka's finger stopped tapping. When the recording ended, silence returned, heavier than before. The only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, like flies circling a corpse. Kendrick sagged in his chair. His lips moved, but no words came. Finally he rasped, "They forced me. Hayes, Albright. They said Sterling was a fool, that the market needed a collapse. I didn't—" "You didn't what?" Harrison cut in, his voice low and venomous. "Didn't think you'd get caught? Didn't think a waitress would know the math better than you? You weren't forced, Robert. You were bought. 5 million in crypto says so." He turned to the investors. "Gentlemen, you've been lied to. But you haven't been ruined yet, thanks to Miss." Rossi Davenport pushed his glasses higher on his nose, his voice hoarse. "And what do you propose now?" Before Harrison could answer, Isabella spoke. Her tone was calm, but her eyes burned. "We prove the corrected formula works. Not the one Kendrick doctored. Mine, the real one. Build a reactor that doesn't explode, that doesn't lie. If you want profit, it will be there. If you want legacy, It will last longer than any of us. But it starts with truth. Tanaka studied her for a long, silent moment. Then, for the first time that morning, he spoke. His English was precise, every word chosen like a blade. "Courage," he said, "is the rarest commodity in business. And the most valuable." The words hung in the air. Harrison saw the flicker of respect in the investor's eyes, and for the first time since midnight, he allowed himself a breath that wasn't clenched like a fist. But the fight wasn't finished. Outside those glass walls, Hayes still moved his pieces, and inside, Kendrick wasn't done snarling. He leaned forward, chains rattling. His voice was raw, desperate. "You think this saves you? Hayes will crush you. He owns senators. He owns regulators. You can't fight him with napkin math and waitress courage. You're already dead. You just don't know it." Isabella met his gaze, unblinking. "Then I guess we'll see which one of us the world believes, the man in handcuffs or the woman who stopped a bomb before it went off." The guards hauled Kendrick to his feet. His curses echoed down the hall as the door slammed behind him. The room exhaled. Harrison straightened his jacket, turning back to the investors with a grim smile. "Gentlemen, we just survived an ambush. But war isn't over. Hayes will strike back harder than ever. The question is, will you stand with me or with him?" The city outside seemed brighter than it had any right to be. Sunlight spilled over the glass towers like liquid gold, blinding, merciless, almost mocking. For Harrison Sterling, that light felt less like dawn and more like a spotlight, a reminder that secrets don't stay buried long, not in Manhattan. By mid-afternoon, the news had leaked. Not the whole story, not yet, but enough. Whispers in the financial press. Sterling deal delayed. Sources cite internal dispute. Stock tickers hiccuped, then dropped. Reporters circled the Sterling Dynamics Tower like gulls around a fishing boat. Every minute of silence from the company fed the sharks. Harrison stood in his office with his jacket off, sleeves rolled, staring at the skyline as if it might blink first. Behind him, Isabella Rossi pored over a series of data models projected onto the glass wall. Her hair was pulled back now, her waitress uniform replaced by a borrowed lab coat. It hung loose on her frame, but the authority she carried in it was undeniable. "You know he won't stay quiet," she said, her eyes fixed on the shifting graphs. "Kendrick will talk. Hayes will spin it. By tomorrow morning, they'll have a story ready to bury us." Harrison didn't move. "Then we make sure our story hits harder." He turned, his face cut sharp by the light. "The corrected formula. Yours. How soon can it be tested?" Her heart kicked. "With the right equipment?" "A week. Less if I have full access to the labs." "You'll have it," Harrison said. He pressed a button on his desk. "Gavin, lock down R&D. From this moment forward, Ms. Rossi has unrestricted clearance. Anyone who objects can look for a new job." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then the curt voice of his head of security. "Understood." Bella felt a tremor of something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Hope. But it was fragile, like glass balanced on a fingertip. She had been crushed before. She had been erased before. This time she needed proof that couldn't be stolen, couldn't be silenced. Harrison moved closer, lowering his voice. "When this goes public, Hayes will unleash hell. He'll drag your name, mine, anyone's he can. He'll call you a fraud. He'll call me desperate. But if we can show them the truth, numbers, results, he loses his teeth." She met his eyes. There was something there she hadn't seen before. Not just calculation, not just ambition. It was respect, raw, and unpolished. "All right," she said. "Steady now. Then let's show them." By evening, the conference center at Sterling Dynamics was packed. Investors, analysts, reporters, all summoned on short notice. Harrison had called it a clarification session. In reality, it was a trial by fire. The air buzzed with suspicion, the kind of static that comes before a thunderstorm. Bella stood in the wings, palms damp, heart racing. She had spoken in lecture halls before, defended her research to skeptical professors. But this was different. These people didn't want truth. They wanted blood or reassurance, whichever came first. Harrison took the stage, tall and unflinching under the floodlights. Cameras clicked like locusts. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority forged in boardrooms and battlefields alike. Sterling Dynamics has always stood for innovation, for pushing the limits of what is possible. Last night, I was prepared to sign a deal that would have defined the future of green energy. But new information came to light, information too important to ignore. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Harrison let them buzz, then continued. "I will not hide from you. There was an error in the foundation of the Sterling Kendrick catalyst. An error that, if left unchecked, could have been catastrophic. That error was brought to my attention not by my head of R&D, but by someone the world had overlooked." He gestured to the side stage. "Isabella Rossi, former Caltech researcher, the true author of the tunneling equation you've all seen in our white papers." The spotlight snapped to her. For a second she froze, a deer on the tracks. Then she forced her legs to move, carrying her to the podium. The murmurs grew louder. Reporters scribbled. Davenport and Tanaka sat in the front row, their expressions unreadable. Bella gripped the lectern. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. 6 years ago, I discovered a flaw in the equation that underpins this project. I reported it. I was ignored. My work was stolen. Last night, I saw the same flaw written on a napkin, about to be signed into a $100 million deal. I spoke up because silence would have meant disaster, not just financial, but human. She tapped the screen behind her. Equations flared to life, projected large enough to fill the room. Numbers and symbols danced in elegant lines. She walked them through it, step by step, her voice gaining strength as the old fire returned. She showed the instability, the explosive potential, the danger. Then she showed the correction, the clean, elegant fix, the Rossi equation. "This," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, "is the difference between a reactor that fails and one that powers the future. This is the difference between a bomb and a breakthrough." The room was silent. Reporters had stopped scribbling. Even the skeptics leaned forward. Harrison stepped up beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling Dynamics will not move forward on lies. We will build on truth. Miss Ross will head a new division, Rossi Sterling Innovations, and we invite you to judge us not on promises, but on results. Within 1 week, you will see a live demonstration. Until then, the contracts remain unsigned. A wave of voices erupted. Questions, protests, demands. Harrison raised a hand. "You want answers? You'll have them. But not tonight. Tonight, you know this. Sterling Dynamics is not for sale. Not to lies, not to fear, not to thieves." The press coverage that followed was a storm. Some called Harrison reckless. Some hailed him as courageous. Headlines splashed Bella's name across the world. Waitress to scientist. The woman who stopped a billion-dollar deal. Hayes, true to form, struck back within hours. Omnigen's PR machine churned out statements questioning Bella's credibility, calling her a disgruntled former student with no published record. Anonymous leaks painted her as unstable, unreliable, a nobody. But the smear campaign couldn't drown out the images of her standing at that podium, equations glowing behind her, voice steady as steel. And then came the real hammer. Federal investigators opened inquiries into Omnigen's dealings. Someone had leaked Kendrick's confession, the audio Bella had unearthed. Hayes denied, deflected, threatened lawsuits. But the cracks in his empire had begun to show. Late that night, back in the quiet of the lab, Bella sat alone before the reactor prototype. The hum of the machines was steady, like a heartbeat. She traced her fingers over the polished steel, the culmination of years she thought she had lost. Harrison entered quietly, setting 2 cups of coffee on the counter. He didn't speak at first. He just stood beside her, looking at the reactor as though it were a fragile child. "You changed everything," he said finally. His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Not just for the company." For me, Bella let out a shaky laugh. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes," Harrison said, his eyes on her, "that's the bravest thing in the world." For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the reactor filled the silence, steady and alive. Tomorrow, the war with Hayes would continue. Tomorrow, the world would keep testing them. But tonight, for the first time in years, Isabella Rossi allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth had a fighting chance. Autumn came to New York like a slow exhale, brushing the skyscrapers with cool wind and copper light. The heat of summer scandals had faded, replaced by the steady thrum of rebuilding. Sterling Dynamics, once trembling on the edge of collapse, was alive. Barely, stubbornly, gloriously alive. But if you asked the interns in the lab who had saved the company, they wouldn't say Harrison Sterling. They would point, almost shyly, to the woman in the white coat with ink-stained fingers and a stubborn spark in her eyes. Isabella Rossi. 6 months had passed since the night of the ruined dinner, the whispered warning, the napkin that nearly lit a fuse under half the industry. In those 6 months, Bella had gone from ghost to headline, from invisible waitress to reluctant icon. She hated the interviews, but endured them because every question about betrayal or formulas or resilience gave her a chance to do what she hadn't been allowed to do 6 years ago: put her own name to her own work. The Rossi equation, once buried under theft and fear, now hung in polished frames in research labs across the world. A neat little R in the corner, proof that a waitress with tired eyes could still outwit the titans. One afternoon, she stood at the tall windows of the Rossi Sterling Innovation Center, coffee cooling in her hand. Below her, Manhattan glittered, restless as ever. Inside the lab behind her, her team ran tests, laughter rising over the hum of servers. The air smelled of ozone and fresh paint, of a place still new enough to feel like possibility. Harrison stepped in quietly, not in his usual armor of dark suits, but in shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked tired, but in a human way, not the brittle exhaustion she'd first seen in him. "They indicted Hayes this morning," he said, handing her a folded newspaper. On the front page, Omnigen CEO charged in corporate espionage scandal. Underneath, smaller photos of Kendrick and Professor Albright, both looking like men who had gambled and lost. Bella's fingers traced the headline. She should have felt triumph, justice, and part of her did. But another part, the scarred part, just felt tired. They'll remember him for the scandal, she said quietly. Not for the damage he almost caused. Harrison studied her. And they'll remember you for the opposite. She shook her head with a faint smile. I don't want to be remembered. I just want the work to stand on its own. The work will, he said simply. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was companionable, like two people who had walked through fire and discovered they could still breathe on the other side. Later that evening, Bella found herself on a quiet rooftop near the Hudson. The city spread out like a constellation flipped upside down. She thought of the years she had spent hiding, the black apron that had been both shield and prison. She thought of the napkin, the whisper, the moment she chose to step out of the shadows. What had all of it meant? Not just vindication, not revenge. It meant that truth, however small, however fragile, still had teeth. It meant that the world could overlook you, dismiss you, bury you, and still one moment of courage could turn the tide. She breathed in the sharp autumn air. The city smelled less like money tonight and more like promise. Behind her, the rooftop door creaked. Harrison stepped out, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one without speaking, then leaned against the railing beside her. For a long time, they just watched the city burn its neon candles. 2 survivors, 2 conspirators of truth, bound not by contracts, but by something harder to define, respect carved out of chaos. Finally, Harrison spoke. Funny thing, he said with a wry smile. I went to that dinner to sign $100 million deal. I thought I was buying the future. Turns out the future was already sitting at my table, pouring water. Bella laughed softly, shaking her head. And you almost missed it. I almost did, he admitted. But you didn't let me. The city roared beneath them. Somewhere out there, deals were being signed, lies polished into profit, fortunes made and lost. But up here, for the first time in a long while, Isabella Rossi felt steady. She had walked through betrayal, obscurity, and fear, and come out not erased, but etched deeper. The waitress was gone. The scientist remained. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.